This is an ODB Films production. Visit odbfilms.com today.
In Latin, Renovo means to renew, restore, or revive. This show is all about growing in our understanding and practice of faith. Past episodes are available wherever you like to listen to podcasts. I'm Doug Tuke, Vice President of Ministry Advancement at ODB Films. And today we take a look at the Vatican Library. This came up in our St. Peter's Bones episode, which you should totally check out. But I really wanted to do a show specifically about the library, and this is it. It's an amazing story. Where all this information came from, why it's there, what the heck we do with it, where it's going, what's the future. Love it. Cannot wait to share the show with you. Dig in. If you are a library geek, you are going to have to pull the car over or get out of the shower or stop exercising because you're going to be freaking out. If you're not, I promise it's still super fascinating. I was blown away by the history of this and kind of what it is and why it is. So the Vatican Library begins during the Renaissance. No real surprise there. It's a time when there was lots of scribes, illuminators, people binding books, printers. They prided themselves on creating books that were more like as physically beautiful as their contents were illuminating. So they were something to behold specifically. So owning or reading a book at this time offered really not only like pleasure for the brain, but also it was something to look at. It was amazing. It was a social experience. So during this time, it was mostly in monasteries that tons of books were collected or being created, used for study and whatnot. And it was the scriptoria of these monasteries where the monks would create books for their own use, as well as any kind of outside commissions. Now, at the beginning of the Renaissance period, Rome was practically a desert where once this great city had thrived. So in the 14th century, the seat of papal rule had been moved from Rome to Avignon. That's a good show. We'll have to do that, the Avignon papacy in southern France. But by the late 14th century, the authority of the papal government was reestablished in Rome, and it became the papal states kind of as they pushed into later Renaissance. So it was soon after this that Pope Nicholas V, 1447, 1455, he set out to build a new Rome, and his plan to build sort of an extensive public works to provide both defense for the church, because it had been attacked and destroyed, and to lure pilgrims and scholars. That's what really began this total transformation of the city, which was pretty cool. So the popes, they had always collected books in their own private libraries, but at the time, these super important collections of books were mostly confined to churches or monasteries, like we said, or super wealthy individuals. So most people rarely had the opportunity to actually view or study a book. So Nicholas decided he wanted to create a public library for the use of all scholars. And it wasn't meant to be just a collection of books. He wanted to establish this institution, like a central public library for scholarship. So Nicholas begins to increase his own collection by purchasing tons of volumes, exploring, hiring these copyists to copy originals that would not be bought from their owners, but basically just the first copies. He also invited Italian and exiled Byzantine scholars to Rome. He commissioned them to translate Greek classics into Latin for his library. Since the invention of printing, the collection of printed books had begun as well. It was around similar time. So Pope Nicholas was an expert calligraphist, and he was actually able to personally oversee the work done by those copying and binding. He had the writing done on the best paper. He had most of the manuscripts bound in this sort of crimson, fastened with silver clasps. I mean, he had a brain for this. He was totally into it. So Nicholas's death prevented him from carrying out his idea of a public library, but the idea was adopted by his successor, Sixtus IV, Pope from 1471 to 1484. And it was common practice when a pope died to leave his collections and papers to his family's archives and not to the next pope, although some of these families' collections actually come back to the Vatican Library as donations. But Nicholas left Sixtus 3 distinct collections or libraries, one of Latin codices, one of Greek codices, and then the secret archives of the papacy itself. So Nicholas was the first pope to leave his library as a central gift to his patronage, to the next pope. Sixtus establishes a permanent area to house the volumes, records all the secret archives in the Vatican Palace, and he called it the Palatine Library. It was equipped with shelves, desks, benches, presses. A guy named Giovanni Tortelli was named the director of the library, and he prepares the first catalog of the collection. So, however, the rooms that actually stored these volumes were super small, kind of dark, damp, and they really needed to be improved. if there was ever going to be a public library established specifically. So as well as if you want to preserve the books, this space was not going to work. Okay. So the library was enlarged by Julius II, 1503 to 1513. Now we're getting towards the Reformation, right? It was later rebuilt by Sixtus V. It was considered a monstrous undertaking, this gigantic expense, cost of over $25,000, which at the time was a ton. It rose to over $40,000 after furnishing an artwork. I mean, just a fortune at the time, right? There were beautiful frescoes. It was lighted by these large windows, furnished with elaborate wooden benches, where most books were chained, as was kind of the practice of the day. So we'll talk more about that later. But the library became a spectacular work of art. And it was at this time that it became known as the Vatican Library, like officially titled the Vatican Library. Even Sixtus' gigantic library soon became really full, and gradually the collection spread throughout hallways and into all these different adjoining rooms. It was Pope Pius X who eventually remedied that whole situation by relocating the nearby Vatican Press and assigning its space to the Vatican Library. So the growth of the collection of the Vatican Library just rapidly expanded. Large and small purchases, donations continued to fill the space. Examples would be like the transference of the Heidelberg Library to Rome in the 18th century and the contributions of Pope Clement XI. These were huge. They dispatched scholars to all parts of the Orient to purchase manuscripts and regarded as he's the founder of the Oriental section, which is huge. These magnificent prices were paid for some of these texts, and they made them really attractive to a lot of scholars. So they were doing what they set out to do, create a space for pilgrims to come and really be overwhelmed by this single location. By functioning as an academic center, the library was actually able to do what war couldn't do. It was able to maintain the prestige of the papacy among intellectuals and help to combat heresies and provide access to the truths of the ancient world. So humanist studies like Latin poetry and the study of classical ruins were purposely cultivated by the Vatican, and it became recognized throughout Europe for its total sophistication, humor, wide variety of scholarly interests. I mean, this was the place to be. If you were going to study, this is the place to be. And it's interesting to note that some areas of study, like Galileo's ideas, were not considered to be tolerable scientific ideas by the advanced scholarship at the time in the Vatican Library. We did a show on Galileo. You should really listen to it because there was some conspiracy amongst these library scholars that really were the reason for Galileo's silencing and all the controversy that happened. Not the Pope, but these sort of library scholars. Check out that show. It's really good. So during the Renaissance, the library offered a really highly advanced facility for scholarly work, right? Its collections were considered comprehensive, the staff educated, super informed. It was Europe's finest resource of Oriental studies, right? There were rules and procedures in place for controlling and maintaining that collection. So each librarian had an inventory of the books in notebook form that was adequate at the time for a collection of a few thousand books. As the collection grew, shelf lists were added as well. So most of the manuscripts were chained to benches, like we talked about, which were actually tables with benches attached to them. And each of these was dedicated to a particular subject. And then the scholars who wished to use them had to study them in place. So many more of the manuscripts were stored in low, beautifully painted wooden presses in the wings of the buildings that were several hundred yards long. I mean, this is just huge, right? The public would be permitted to access only the reading room. So when a scholar desired a certain manuscript stored in the presses, the attendant had to travel a really long distance from the reading room to the presses, carrying back and forth these massive volumes. You could just imagine. So there was often the fear of theft and damage to the manuscripts and the books. So these attendants had to keep a really close watch on all the patrons all the time. So the librarians all swore these solemn oaths to preserve and account for every single book in their care. Amazing. Scholars were allowed to borrow volumes up until the early 17th century. The circulation system kind of consisted of registers that recorded loans and then their returns, like a bank. So some of these registers still exist, and we can actually see scholars like famous philosophers, Pico della Mirandola, borrowing and then returning the works of Roger Bacon. When a scholar would borrow a volume, they also had to take the chains that held it to the table, right? Modern librarians would probably love that. It was a reminder for them to bring them back, right? So when books were not returned in a timely fashion and the librarians themselves were not able to persuade the borrower to return them, the Pope himself would have to send out a recall notice, which would usually produce results, right? So the Pope is like, hey, bring me back my book, right? So Rome begins attracting this huge amount of scholars, right? So many kinds of creative institutions begin to emerge. In the 15th century, Rome's printers began creating these fashionable classical texts and commentaries. In the 16th century, Rome's postal service began the most rapid and sophisticated in Europe. And in the late 17th century, there emerged in Rome a body of political observers who produced newsletters that were read throughout Europe, really kind of ancestors to the modern newspaper. So by the end of the 17th century, Rome was this grand city with a super unique drama and excitement. Unfortunately, as the city, the library, and the Vatican itself, they flourished, but problems really began to arise. The popes they were just super ambitious. They began supporting a lot of wars. Their extravagant living, questionable moral behavior was criticized, as it should be. Many people left the practices of the Catholic Church because they felt that their practices were inappropriate. So the Protestant Reformation begins in 1517 with Luther's protest against all of that was going on. He attacks traditional doctrines and practices, as well as the papacy specifically. And he didn't have to work very hard to convince the masses of all that extravagance, the immorality of the popes, their military, political, architectural, artistic pursuits. It wasn't hard to whip up a frenzy. So the leaders of the church really had no idea but to redefine kind of the beliefs and practices if they wanted to survive the Reformation. Not doctrine and dogma per se, as much as what the heck, how to behave properly. So the constitution of the church was made into a more centralized form, and the cardinals became officers of papal policy rather than these independent, lords or barons. So it was these curial intellectuals, members of the curia, including the Vatican librarians, that helped to use the context of the culture, theology, church history, scholarly pursuits, religious art to defend their faith and activities, the counter-Reformation, right? So during and really shortly after the Reformation, the policies regarding the vision for the Vatican Library and the access to it changed. The library began to focus on ecclesiastical history, law. These were matters of relevance to reform within the church. The Codex of Prohibited Books was drawn up, and certain persons, such as Protestant scholars, were prohibited. We talked about that. We have a whole show that's on that, the index of books and why they were what they were. Things did not change for a long time. I mean, over the next 3 centuries, even when other libraries all over Europe were bustling with activity, readers scarcely ever came to the Vatican Library. They just didn't come back. So in 1809, Napoleon Bonaparte arrested and actually imprisoned Pius VII, 1800 to 1823, and ordered the contents of the Vatican archives moved to Paris. And over 3,000 chests of materials were shipped. Wow, right? So after the defeat of Napoleon in 1814, it took 3 years to move those materials back to the Vatican. That's unbelievable. So it wasn't until the time of Leo XIII, 1878, that the Vatican Library is described as having an awakening after a really long sleep. In August 1883, Pope Leo opens the library once again to scholars. New rules were formed. A spacious reading room was opened. Way less chains on the books, right? New staff was hired. And the office of the cardinal librarian was regarded as a position. It was a position of a prefect. So somebody was assigned to that. So from 1895 to 1914, Father Franz Earle, or Earle, was the prefect of the Vatican Library, and he's credited with bringing the library back to life, basically. He said he was said to possess a ton of knowledge of the workings of the library. He had undying energy, tons of patience, a wide range of scientific and technical knowledge. This guy was a go-to guy, right? Perfect fit. He starts revising a lot of regulations and then basically assuring that they were followed more stringently than had been expected in the past. So he begins reorganizing the collection to promote proper storage. He gave priority to the preservation and the restoration of damaged manuscripts that were in the collection. He also did away with some of the old practices, such as the custom of marking this like a little small black cross on the back of all manuscripts, which, because of their contents, were not deemed advisable to place at the disposal of scholars indiscriminately. So he was like, no, come on, this information is for everybody. Come check it out, right? So some of his other projects included seeking out new collections. He got into a ton of them. He was just amazing. He devised a really large reference area for the convenience of students that were working with the manuscripts. The reference collection was actually classified, according to the Library of Congress scheme, as were all these new books, which is incredible. So Father Earle renovated and he really modernized everything. the reading rooms. There was a lot easier entrance into the library. He added an additional 14 miles of steel shelving, and he also installed a new ventilation system for the stacks. Just imagine that. That's insane. So the new stacks were of the American design, these kind of standard stacks with open bar shelves composed of like 3 different tiers, various different lengths, 3 stairways, an elevator was provided for access, and across a top bridge that united the stacks to the cataloging room. Just a massive endeavor, right? Just a massive. So next to this reading room, there's a new catalog card together with all these sets of cards from the Library of Congress, and these were all housed in catalog drawers. This was new. So Father Early also removed all the manuscripts from the staterooms and housed them in fireproof compartments near reading and reference areas. So all these library attendants were undoubtedly thankful to Father. I mean, he just knew what was up. Just unbelievable. Instead of having to carry all this stuff back and forth, these massive volumes down these long corridors, that was over. I mean, they were in these secure rooms. Scholars could enter them. Huge deal. So Father also set up the first library conservation department in Europe, and he began a program of photographically reproducing a lot of the important works in the collection to assist with their preservation while making them way more accessible to scholars. So once this preservation activities, all that stuff was initiated, materials from other libraries were eventually transferred to the Vatican Library for safer preservation. So he really raised the dignity of the space. Unbelievable. So the department devoted to the repairing and the damaged manuscripts, it became a super important part of the Vatican Library. Father Early encouraged other libraries, lots of them across the world, to study the repair and preservation of library materials and then to share their methods. He wanted to be the best. He wanted to know what the best practices were. Kind of cool. So the Vatican Library Clinic developed lots of new processes of its own and then accepted other libraries' volumes for repair, depending on their importance, which is kind of incredible. So with the help of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Library of Congress, between 1927 and 1939, this amazing card catalog to all the printed books was created. That was it. This is the one where everything's in there. The Reverend Leonard E. Boyle was the chief librarian of the Vatican Library from 1984 to 1997. He's given a ton of credit for basically continuing the modernization of the library. Father Boyle computerized the library's catalogs, wired the main reading rooms for laptops, hired women for the first time, right? Yay, right? And then it says he liberalized the strict dress code. Thank you, Father Boyle. We appreciate it. In 1995, a professor of art at Ohio State University actually stole 2 leaves from a medieval manuscript once owned by Petrarch. And Father Boyle was actually kind of criticized for letting this guy have access to the library, and he got fired over the controversy. Isn't that awful? Ohio State, come on, Buckeyes. Don't be stealing stuff out of the Vatican Library. What the heck? Today, the Vatican Library houses by far the richest collection of Western manuscripts. It's unbelievable. Printed books in the world. Even though the collection of printed books, it's not as large a number, the percentage of rare and valuable works is way more than is found in any other library with that many proportions. So in the modern day world, the Vatican Library is unbelievable. It's an invaluable historical resource. Scholars all agree. I mean, it's this rich historical record of science, learning, the arts, European history for the past millennium. Unbelievable. The manuscripts, the printed books that are in there today are, you can't help but realize they're the result of a really long and involved history of deliberate acquisition, humanist ideals. There was a desire there to acquire and share scholarly pursuits, and this is great. It's a treasure of humanity, and it really is the place of massive riches. I mean, it's worth your time to get to see unbelievable stuff. So there it is. That's it. I mean, next time you go to Rome, if you've never been there, if you've never seen it, the history is unbelievable. It's a great gift of the church to the world. It always makes me laugh when the Catholic Church gets criticized for it's kind of anti-intellectualism or science and religion don't match. And I'm just thinking to myself, I'm like, the church has been literally like a safety space for great scholarship when it comes to science. I mean, why the heck wouldn't you? Why would you think that it's anti-science? That's what it's designed for. Amazing stuff. Vatican Library. Now you know. Thanks for listening. Sincerely, we're partners in the journey of faith. I hope you will share the Renovo podcast with friends and foes. Send your topic suggestions, questions, or comments to doug@odbfilms.com. Always remember to engage the tradition and live the conversion. Until next time, God bless.